Woman insults soldier. On plane, but when she reads the news. Next day, she breaks down in tears. The bustling atmosphere of Chicago O'Hare. International Airport echoed with announcements, rolling suitcases, and the constant hum of travelers rushing to their destinations. Victoria Reynolds, impeccably dressed in her tailored Prada suit and red-bottomed Louboutin heels, glanced at her Apple Watch with growing irritation. The flight to Seattle had already been delayed by 45 minutes, and her patience was wearing dangerously thin. The exclusive first-class lounge had provided little comfort as she watched her carefully planned schedule crumble. As the senior vice president of West Coast operations for a major tech company, every minute of her day was meticulously scheduled. This delay meant she would barely make it to her keynote speech at the Women in Technology Summit, where she was supposed to inspire the next generation of female tech leaders. When boarding finally began, Victoria strode purposefully toward the gate, her designer carry-on trailing behind her. Her platinum frequent flyer status, combined with her first-class ticket, meant she was among the first to board. Yet as she approached her seat, she noticed the gate agent allowing a man in military fatigues to board alongside the first-class passengers. Victoria's perfectly lined lips twisted into a slight sneer. Another example of the preferential treatment. That seemed to follow anyone in uniform. She'd seen it countless times, the priority boarding, the endless thank yous, the almost religious reverence that Americans seem to have for anyone connected to the military. As far as she was concerned, it was all part of the same patriarchal system she'd spent her career fighting against. As she settled into her window seat in 3A, she began organizing her workspace. Her MacBook Pro, iPad, and various folders were arranged precisely how she liked them. She had a presentation to refine during the flight, and she'd planned to use these 4 hours productively. Her moment of organization was interrupted by movement in the aisle. The same soldier from the boarding gate was standing there checking his ticket. Victoria's heart sank as he looked at the seat number above her row. "Please, not here," she thought to herself. "Excuse me, ma'am," the soldier said politely, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "I believe I'm in 3B. Victoria noticed his name tape read Anderson T. as he carefully stored a worn military backpack in the overhead compartment. He moved with a noticeable stiffness, particularly on his right side, and she couldn't help but notice a slight tremor in his hands as he closed the bin. "I suppose they gave you some sort of military upgrade?" she remarked coldly, not bothering to mask her disdain. "These seats aren't cheap, you know." The soldier, Anderson, settled into his seat with careful movements. "No, ma'am," he replied evenly. "I paid full fare for this seat." Victoria let out an exaggerated sigh, turning slightly toward the window. "Right, because the military doesn't get enough special treatment already. Priority boarding, discounts everywhere, constant praise. It must be nice to have the whole country worship you just for wearing a uniform." She could feel other passengers shooting disapproving glances in her direction, but she didn't care. In her mind, she'd earned her success through hard work and determination, fighting against genuine discrimination and barriers. She'd clawed her way up the corporate ladder without any special treatment or universal adoration. Anderson remained quiet for a moment, then reached into his breast pocket and pulled out what looked like a creased photograph. Victoria caught a glimpse of it. A group of men in combat gear, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in what appeared to be a desert landscape. "Let me guess," she said sarcastically. "Another propaganda shot of our brave heroes bringing freedom to some foreign country. I'm sure that looks great in recruitment materials." The soldier's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "No, ma'am. These were my brothers in Task Force Shadow. This was taken 2 days before our convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar." Victoria rolled her eyes, turning her attention to her laptop. "Oh, here we go. Another war story to justify the billions we waste on the military-industrial complex. I suppose next you'll tell me you're on some noble mission right now, too." The flight attendant's announcement about departure procedures provided a brief respite from the tension. Victoria made a show of checking her emails one final time before switching to airplane mode, pointedly ignoring her seatmate as he carefully tucked the photograph back into his pocket. As the plane began to taxi, Victoria noticed Anderson gripping his armrest tightly, his knuckles turning white. She assumed it was fear of flying, another crack in the facade of military toughness. She couldn't resist one more jab. "Not so brave without your big guns and tanks, are you?" she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear. Anderson turned to look at her directly for the first time, his green eyes carrying a weight that momentarily gave her pause. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I understand you have your opinions about the military, but you don't know me or my story. And right now, I'm just trying to get to Seattle to see my son before his surgery tomorrow." Victoria adjusted her seat, deliberately angling herself away from Anderson. "Oh, playing the family card now?" she scoffed. "And let me guess, it's some special military hospital providing free treatment while the rest of us pay thousands in medical bills." The plane climbed through turbulent air, causing a noticeable shudder. Anderson's grip on the armrest tightened further, and Victoria noticed a slight sheen of sweat on his forehead. His breathing had become more controlled, almost methodical, as if he was following some kind of pattern. "Actually," he replied after a moment, his voice barely audible above the engine noise, "we're heading to Seattle Children's Hospital. My son Jake, he needs specialized neurological surgery. The military insurance only covers part of it." A middle-aged woman across the aisle shot Victoria a disapproving look, but she pressed on. "Well, that's a convenient story, I'm sure. Once word gets out, people will be falling all over themselves to help. That's how it works these days, isn't it? Wave the flag, mention military service, and watch the donations pour in." Anderson pulled out his phone once they reached cruising altitude, his hands still trembling slightly as he navigated to his photo gallery. Victoria caught a glimpse of a young boy's face, maybe 7 or 8 years old, smiling from a hospital bed. She noticed the child had what appeared to be surgical scars along his hairline. "That's Jake," Anderson said quietly. "This was taken after his first surgery 6 months ago. The doctors thought they got it all then, but—" He trailed off, his voice catching slightly. "Got all of what?" Victoria found herself asking, immediately irritated at her own curiosity. "The tumor," Anderson replied, swiping to another photo of Jake, this one showing him in what appeared to be a school play dressed as a tree. "It's an aggressive form of brain cancer. The first surgery helped, but it's growing back faster than they expected." Victoria busied herself with her laptop, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. "Well, that's what the VA is for, isn't it? More government handouts." "The VA?" Anderson paused, taking a deep breath. "The VA doesn't cover experimental procedures, and that's what Jake needs now. The standard treatments haven't worked." During another bout of turbulence, Anderson winced visibly, his right hand moving instinctively to his side. Victoria noticed what looked like burn scars extending from under his sleeve. "Combat injury?" she asked, more accusatory than curious. "IED blast," he confirmed. "The same one from the photo. Lost 3 of my brothers that day. The blast threw me 30 feet. Broke most of my right side, severe burns, traumatic brain. Injury. The doctor said I wouldn't walk again." Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her laptop. "Well, that's what happens when you sign up to fight in foreign wars. Nobody forced you to enlist." Anderson turned to face her fully, and for the first time, she noticed the faint scarring along his neck and jaw. "Ma'am, you're right. Nobody forced me to enlist, just like nobody forced me to push my team back when we spotted the IED. Nobody forced me to stay in the Army after my injuries so Jake could keep his medical coverage. And nobody's forcing me to work 3 jobs now to try to pay for his treatment. We all make our choices." A flight attendant approached their row, offering drinks. "Thank you for your service," she said warmly to Anderson. "This one's on us." "No, thank you," Anderson replied politely. "Just water, please, and I'll pay for it." Victoria watched as he struggled slightly to reach his wallet with his right hand. "See?" she said, though her voice carried slightly less venom than before. "Special treatment everywhere you go." "Ms. Reynolds," Anderson said, surprising her with the use of her name. He must have glimpsed it on her laptop screen. "I understand you have strong feelings about the military, but right now, I'm not a soldier. I'm just a father trying to get to his son before surgery tomorrow morning, that's all." Victoria noticed him checking his phone again, his face tightening with concern as he read what appeared to be a message. "Bad news?" she asked, unable to completely mask the hint of genuine curiosity in her voice. "Jake's fever is up again," Anderson replied, his voice strained. "The doctors are monitoring him closely, his immune system." He stopped, composing himself. "The tumor is affecting his immune response. Every infection is a risk now." Victoria found herself watching as Anderson pulled up his son's medical chart on his phone. Despite her best efforts to maintain her dismissive attitude, she couldn't help but notice the complexity of Jake's condition. Pages of medications, treatment protocols, and surgery notes. "You seem to understand all that medical terminology pretty well," she observed, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Had to learn," Anderson replied, scrolling through the chart. "After my injuries, I spent 18 months in medical rehabilitation. Learned more medical terminology than I ever wanted to know. Now I'm using it to understand Jake's treatment. Funny how life works sometimes." The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, and Victoria noticed Anderson's breathing pattern change again, controlled, measured breaths that seemed almost practiced. "PTSD?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. "Among other things," he answered quietly. "The blast left me with some anxiety issues. Flying can be challenging. But Jake needs me in Seattle, so here I am." Victoria occupied herself with her presentation for the next hour, but found herself increasingly distracted by Anderson's periodic phone checks and the way his hands still trembled slightly each time the plane encountered turbulence. Despite her best efforts to maintain her wall of hostility, cracks were beginning to form in her armor of indifference. When the meal service began, she noticed Anderson politely declining the first-class meal. Instead, he pulled out what looked like a protein bar from his backpack. The movement caused him to wince again, his right hand instinctively moving to his side. "You should eat something proper if you're injured," Victoria found herself saying, surprising even herself with the comment. Anderson gave her a small, tired smile. "Need to save where I can, between the medical bills and this flight." He trailed off, checking his phone again. Victoria glimpsed a banking app notification showing a low balance warning. "Surely, the military takes care of their own," she pressed, though her tone had lost some of its earlier bite. "All those support programs we hear about." Anderson shifted in his seat, trying to find a comfortable position. "The basic medical coverage is good, ma'am, but Jake's case, it's complicated. The tumor is rare, aggressive. The standard treatments haven't worked and experimental procedures aren't covered. Even with 3 jobs, I'm barely keeping up with the regular bills, let alone the new treatment he needs." Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "3 jobs?" "Yes, ma'am. Still active duty. They let me transfer to a desk position after my injuries. Then security work at night, and I drive for a rideshare company on weekends when Jake is with his mother." He rubbed his right leg absently. "The doctors said I shouldn't stand for long periods with my injuries, but you do what you have to do for your kids." A moment of turbulence caused Anderson to grip his armrest again, his breathing becoming more controlled and measured. Victoria noticed him reaching for something in his pocket, what looked like a small medallion that he began turning over in his hands. "It helps," he explained, catching her glance. "Something my therapist suggested for the anxiety. The blast, Left me with more than just physical scars. PTSD, they call it. Flying is challenging. Enclosed spaces, sudden movements. They can trigger flashbacks. Victoria found herself studying him more carefully now. Beyond the obvious physical injuries, she began to notice other signs. The hyper-awareness of his surroundings. The way he positioned himself to keep both the aisle and window in view. The controlled breathing techniques. "Then why fly?" she asked, her voice softer than before. "Why not drive to Seattle?" "Jake's surgery is tomorrow morning," Anderson replied, showing her his phone screen with a calendar appointment. "Seattle Children's Hospital, 7 a.m. The tumor's growing faster than they expected. His doctor called yesterday. They had a cancellation and could move up the surgery. I couldn't risk missing it by driving." Victoria glanced at the surgical appointment details. The procedure. Name was long and complex, full of medical terminology she didn't understand. But what caught her eye was the estimated cost listed at the bottom, a number that made even her, with her substantial tech industry salary, balk. "That's significant," she said carefully. Anderson nodded. "Yeah, I've sold pretty much everything. I could. My car, my grandfather's watch, even my combat medals. The military community has been trying to help with fundraisers, but..." He trailed off, checking his phone again as another message came through. Victoria caught a glimpse of the text. "Dad, my head really hurts again. The doctors say my pressure is up. Please get here soon." Something in Anderson's expression changed. A flicker of pure fear that he quickly tried to mask. He began typing a response, but his trembling hands made it difficult. Victoria watched as he deleted and retyped several times, trying to find the right words to comfort his son from 30,000 feet in the air. "The hardest part," he said quietly, almost to himself, "is not being there. In combat, you're trained to face the threat head-on, to protect your team. But with this, I can't fight it for him. I can't take his place. All I can do is try to be there, and somehow find a way to pay for the treatment he needs." Victoria found herself remembering something, a memory she'd tried to suppress for years. Her younger brother, Tommy, in a hospital bed much like Jake's, their parents struggling with medical bills while trying to maintain a brave face. She'd been too focused on her budding career then, too convinced that her presence at important meetings was more crucial than being there for her family, by the time she realized her mistake. Her thoughts were interrupted by another message alert on Anderson's phone. This time it was from someone named Dr. Patterson. "Jake's intracranial pressure is continuing to rise. We're starting emergency medication, but we need to move up the surgery. How soon can you get here?" Victoria watched as all color drained from Anderson's face. Anderson's trembling fingers struggled to reply to the doctor's message. Victoria found herself looking at their flight's progress on her screen, still over 2 hours from Seattle. She noticed Anderson pulling up his airline app, desperately, searching for any earlier flights that might be landing sooner. "There's nothing earlier," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His breathing had become more rapid, less controlled. "I should have left yesterday. I should have found a way." Victoria opened her own airline app. Her platinum status gave her access to more flight options. "There's nothing out of Chicago that would get you there faster," she confirmed, surprising herself with her desire to help. "We're already on the fastest route." Anderson nodded grimly, typing a response to the doctor. His hands were shaking, so badly that he had to keep correcting his typing. Victoria caught fragments of his message. "On flight. Landing 5:30 p.m. Please help him until..." Another message came through, this time with a photo. Jake in his hospital bed, his young face pale and drawn with pain, but still managing a weak smile for the camera. Medical equipment surrounded him, and Victoria noticed what appeared to be fresh surgical markings on his head, where they'd apparently had to place a pressure monitor. "He's so brave," Anderson said softly, touching the screen gently. He's been through so much already, and he never complains. Just keeps smiling, telling me not to worry. His voice caught. He's stronger than I ever was in combat. Victoria found herself looking more closely at the photo. Despite his condition, Jake had propped his tablet against his hospital tray, displaying what looked like a school project, a presentation about military veterans. Even sick, he was clearly proud of his father's service. "Is his mother with him?" Victoria asked, noting how the boy seemed alone in the photo. Anderson's face tightened. She couldn't handle it. The pressures of military life, my injuries, then Jake's diagnosis. She left 2 years ago, said she wasn't strong enough to watch him suffer through the treatments. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, more severe this time. Anderson's grip on his armrest turned white-knuckled again, his breathing becoming more erratic. Victoria noticed him fumbling for his medallion, but his shaking hands caused it to fall to the floor, sliding under the seat in front of them. Without thinking, Victoria unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned forward to retrieve it. As she did, she noticed the medallion's inscription, Task Force Shadow, Brothers Forever. On the back were engraved names, presumably the teammates lost, in the IED blast. "Thank you," Anderson said quietly as she handed it back. He held it tightly, his breathing slowly steadying. "The guys would laugh if they could see me now. Special Forces sergeant afraid of a little turbulence." "It's not the turbulence, though, is it?" Victoria found herself asking, her voice gentler than before. "It's not being able to get to him fast enough." Anderson nodded, his composed facade cracking slightly. "In combat, we never left anyone behind. If someone was hurt, we moved heaven and earth to get to them. But now..." He checked his phone again, another message causing him to inhale sharply. His pressure's still rising. They're talking about moving him to intensive care. Victoria watched as he pulled up his banking app again, then a credit card account. She could see multiple declined payment notifications, maxed out credit limits, and pending bill payments that would clearly bounce. He then opened what appeared to be a fundraising page, Hope for Jake, showing they'd raised only a fraction of the amount needed for the experimental treatment. "The regular surgery was covered," he explained, noticing her looking. "But this new procedure, the one that might actually stop the tumor instead of just buying time, insurance won't touch it. Too experimental, they say. I've tried everything, loans, credit cards, even reached out to veteran support organizations, but the amount." He showed her the full treatment plan and cost breakdown. The number at the bottom made Victoria's previous estimate look modest by comparison. She noticed Anderson had already signed away his military pension as collateral for medical loans, had sold his home to move into a small apartment, and had liquidated every asset he owned. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely audible, "I lie awake at night wondering if I made the right choice staying in the military after my injuries. Basic insurance is good, but if I'd taken a medical discharge and gone into private sector work instead, maybe I could have afforded better coverage. Maybe Jake would have had better options." Another message alert. "Jake asking for you. Getting anxious. Please advise ETA." Victoria watched as Anderson typed back with shaking hands. "Tell him I'm coming. Tell him to be brave just a little longer. Tell him." The message remained unfinished as Anderson's composure finally cracked, a single tear rolling down his scarred cheek. Victoria found herself reaching into her Prada handbag, pulling out a pack of tissues. She hesitated for a moment before offering one to Anderson. He accepted with a quiet nod of thanks, quickly wiping his eyes and trying to regain his composure. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "It's just, when you're in combat, everything is clear. You have your mission, your training, your team. But this..." He gestured at his phone, where Jake's messages continued to arrive. "I feel so helpless." Another text came through, this time from the hospital's financial department. "Reminder, Deposit for experimental procedure required 24 hours before scheduled treatment. Current balance insufficient. Victoria watched as Anderson opened his email, where multiple rejected loan applications filled his inbox. Each one seemed to carry the same message: too much existing medical debt, insufficient income despite his multiple jobs, too high risk. "Have you considered?" Victoria started, then stopped herself, realizing how her previous accusations about military handouts now felt like ash in her mouth. "Everything," Anderson replied, understanding her unfinished question. "Veterans organizations, medical charity programs, even tried selling my military pension for a lump sum. But Jake's type of tumor is so rare, and this treatment is so new. Most programs don't cover experimental procedures." He pulled up a medical document on his phone, Jake's latest scan results. Even to Victoria's untrained eye, the growth was obvious, aggressive, pressing against areas of his brain that controlled critical functions. "The traditional treatments bought us time," Anderson explained, his voice clinical in the way people get when they're trying to distance themselves from overwhelming emotion. "But each surgery, each round of chemotherapy, they're just slowing it down, not stopping it. This new procedure, it's showing real promise in clinical trials. First time I've had real hope since the diagnosis." Victoria found herself studying Anderson's face. The scars she'd initially dismissed as merely physical now seemed to tell a deeper story. "How did you, after the IED, how did you keep going?" Anderson was quiet for a moment, his hand absently touching his right side where she knew he carried the worst of his injuries. "You learn to compartmentalize," he finally said. "Break each challenge down into smaller battles." His 8-year-old son, Jake, suffers from an aggressive form of brain cancer that has proven resistant to conventional treatments. "The hardest part is feeling helpless," Anderson says, his combat-earned scars visible as he sits by his son's hospital bed at Seattle Children's Hospital. "In combat, you have a mission, a purpose. You can fight back. But watching your child suffer, there's no enemy to engage, no position to advance on. You just have to watch and try to be strong." "For them?" Victoria glanced at Anderson, who was back on the phone with the hospital, his voice tight with concern as he received updates about Jake's emergency procedure. She turned back to the article. Despite suffering severe injuries in an IED attack that killed 3 of his teammates, Anderson refused medical retirement to maintain his son's military health coverage. He works 3 jobs between his military duties to fund experimental treatments not covered by insurance. His former unit members have been organizing fundraisers, but the costly treatment at Seattle Children's Hospital remains out of reach. "These kids are the real heroes," Anderson says of the children in the cancer ward. "They face every day with such courage. Jake never complains even on his worst days. He just asks when he can go back to school, when he can play baseball again. He makes me feel humble." The article continued with details about Jake's condition and the experimental treatment program, but Victoria could hardly read through her tears. She remembered every cutting remark she'd made about special treatment, every dismissive gesture, every cruel assumption. The photo of Anderson carrying his wounded comrade haunted her, the same man who now sat beside her, trembling, as he read urgently messaged updates about his son's condition. She quickly opened her banking app, then paused. A simple donation wouldn't be enough. As Senior VP of West Coast Operations for Tech Future Industries, she had connections that could make a real difference. Her company's charitable foundation had been looking for a new initiative to support. "Mr. Anderson," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I think I might be able to help." But before she could continue, Anderson's phone rang, the hospital's number. His hands shook so badly he could barely answer it. "Sergeant Anderson?" The doctor's voice came through clearly in the quiet cabin. "We've completed the emergency procedure to relieve the pressure, but Jake's condition is still critical. The tumor's growth rate has accelerated beyond our projections. We need to move forward with the experimental treatment immediately, not next week as planned." I understand this creates a financial challenge, but time is now the critical factor. Victoria watched as Anderson's face crumpled. Doctor, the deposit. I don't have. Without hesitation, Victoria pulled out her corporate card, the one with no spending limit. Doctor, she said, leaning toward Anderson's phone. This is Victoria Reynolds, Senior Vice President of Tech Future Industries. I'll personally guarantee the treatment costs. I'll have my office send the payment confirmation within the hour. Anderson turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ms. Reynolds, I can't possibly. Yes, you can, Victoria cut him off firmly. And that's not all. Our charitable foundation has been looking to fund pediatric medical research. I think we've just found our pilot program. The doctor's voice came back, cautiously hopeful. So we can proceed with prep for the treatment? Absolutely, Victoria confirmed. Whatever Jake needs. And doctor, I want to know more about this experimental program. My company might be interested in funding a broader trial for other children in similar situations. As she hung up, Victoria was already composing emails on her laptop, to her company's foundation board, to the hospitals and development office, to her corporate PR team. The Women in Technology Summit would have to find another keynote speaker. She had more important matters to attend to. Anderson sat in stunned silence, tears flowing freely now. Why? He finally managed to ask. After everything. Why would you help us? Victoria thought of her brother Tommy, of all the time she'd wasted climbing the corporate ladder while he fought his lonely battle. Because, she said softly, sometimes we need someone to remind us what really matters. And sometimes it takes a soldier to teach a civilian about true courage. As dawn broke over Seattle, Victoria Reynolds sat in her temporary office at Seattle Children's Hospital, surrounded by stacks of medical research papers and foundation documents. Her designer briefcase, once filled with tech industry reports, now overflowed with pediatric cancer studies and grant proposals. Ms. Reynolds? A quiet voice interrupted her concentration. She looked up to find Anderson standing in the doorway, still in his security guard uniform from his night shift. How's Jake? She asked immediately, noticing the unusual smile on Anderson's face. The doctor's just finished his morning assessment. Anderson's voice wavered with emotion. The experimental treatment, it's working. The tumor has started shrinking. Victoria felt tears welling in her eyes as she stood up. That's incredible. They're calling it a milestone case, Anderson continued. Dr. Patterson says the results could help develop treatments for other children with similar conditions. Your foundation's support isn't just helping Jake anymore. Victoria walked to the window, looking out at the hospital's healing garden where children and their families found moments of peace. You know, she said softly, my brother, Tommy, loved gardens. Even in his worst days, he'd ask to sit by the window and watch the butterflies. Anderson moved to stand beside her. Jake asked about him yesterday. He wants to know more about the uncle who helped save his life. Victoria turned, surprised. What do you mean? I told him about Tommy, Anderson explained. How losing. Him led you to help us. Jake says Tommy must have been your guardian angel, guiding you to that flight. Victoria smiled through her tears. He would have loved Jake. They share the same fighting spirit. Speaking of fighting spirit, Anderson reached into his pocket and pulled out something that glinted in the morning light, his combat medallion. Jake wanted you to have this. Anderson, I couldn't possibly. He insists, says it's to remind you that you're part of our unit now. Task Force Shadow may have started in combat, but its mission continues here, fighting different battles, saving different lives. Victoria carefully took the medallion, feeling its weight in her palm. I don't deserve this. You know what we say in the military? Anderson smiled. It's not about deserving, it's about serving, and you've more than earned your place in our ranks. At that moment, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Anderson, Jake's asking for both of you. Says he won't start his physical therapy until his two favorite soldiers are there to cheer him on. As they walked toward Jake's room, Victoria clutched the medallion, remembering how differently this story could have ended if she'd stayed locked in her prejudices. The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows, catching the medallion's engraved surface. Task Force Shadow, Brothers Forever. Someone had added a new line below it in careful handwriting, and Sisters Too. Jake's bright smile greeted them as they entered his room, now decorated with both military flags and tech company swag, a perfect blend of his two worlds. "Dad! Aunt Victoria! Watch this!" He proudly lifted his arm, showing strength that hadn't been there just weeks before. Victoria took her usual spot in the chair beside his bed, next to Anderson. Two soldiers of very different battles, united in the most important mission of all, giving a brave young warrior his chance to live. As Jake began his exercises, Victoria realized that some plane journeys don't just take you from one city to another. Sometimes, they take you exactly where your heart needs to be. A year and a half after that fateful flight, the Tommy Reynolds Memorial Research Center had become a beacon of hope for families facing pediatric brain tumors. The modern glass building, nestled within the Seattle Children's Hospital campus, hummed with activity as scientists and doctors worked tirelessly on groundbreaking treatments. Victoria stood in her office, now adorned with photographs that told the story of their journey. Jake's first day post-treatment, the Task Force Hope inaugural meeting, the research center's opening ceremony. But her favorite was the newest addition, a group photo from last week's military family picnic, showing Jake teaching other young patients the proper salute, while Anderson watched proudly. "Aunt Victoria!" Jake's excited voice echoed down the hallway. "Dad says you have to come quick." She hurried out to find Jake practically bouncing with excitement, his Task Force Hope t-shirt proudly displaying his title as Junior Commander. "What is it, soldier?" she asked, matching his serious expression. Sarah's latest scan came back. The tumor's completely gone. His eyes sparkled. Just like mine. Victoria felt her heart soar. Sarah had been their first patient after Jake, and her case had helped prove the treatment's effectiveness. As she followed Jake to the celebration gathering in Sarah's room, she couldn't help but marvel at how different her life was now from her corporate climbing days. The room was packed with familiar faces, Dr. Patterson, the nursing staff, and other Task Force Hope families. Anderson stood in his usual spot by the window, but today he wore a suit instead of his uniform. After retiring from the military, he'd taken on a new role as the center's family support coordinator, using his experience to guide other parents through their battles. "Ms. Reynolds," Dr. Patterson approached with a tablet in hand. "The latest trial results are remarkable. The treatment protocol we developed from Jake's case has now shown an 85% success rate. The medical community is calling it the Shadow Protocol." Victoria smiled at the name, a tribute to the unit that had inadvertently sparked this entire journey. And the Foundation's new funding initiative. 20 more families approved just this morning. Anderson joined them, his face glowing with pride. No more parents having to work 3 jobs or sell their medals. Every child gets their chance at hope. A commotion at the door drew their attention. Several Task Force Hope kids were wheeling in something large covered with a sheet. Jake and Sarah stood at the front, trying to contain their excitement. "We have a surprise," Sarah announced. "For both of you." Jake grabbed the sheet. "Task Force Hope, present arms." The children pulled away the covering to reveal a beautiful mural. It showed 2 paths converging, one a military convoy in the desert, the other a corporate cityscape. At their intersection stood a hospital, surrounded by children in battle against their illnesses. Above it all, a pair of wings spread across the sky, bearing the words, "Tommy's Angels, where hope takes flight." Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes as she read the dedication plaque. "To our commanders, Sergeant Anderson, who taught us that true strength isn't about winning battles but never fighting alone, and Aunt Victoria, who showed us that sometimes angels wear business suits, from your Task Force Hope family." "The kids designed it themselves," Anderson explained softly. They wanted to show how two different worlds came together to create something beautiful. "And look," Jake pointed excitedly, "we included Captain Brave." Sure enough, tucked in the corner was a small teddy bear in military fatigues, standing guard over the children in the mural. As Victoria watched the children admire their artwork, she thought about how far they'd all come from that day on the plane. Her brother Tommy's memory had transformed from a source of guilt into an inspiration for hope. The military world she'd once dismissed had taught her more about courage and service than any corporate boardroom ever had. "Aunt Victoria?" Jake tugged at her hand. "Can we have ice cream to celebrate? Dad says we need your executive approval." She laughed, catching Anderson's amused grin. "Well, as your commanding officer, I think that's an excellent tactical decision." As they headed toward the hospital cafeteria, their small parade of celebrating families drawing smiles from everyone they passed, Victoria realized that sometimes life's most important journeys don't take you to a destination. They bring you home to where you were always meant to be. Behind them, the mural watched over the ward, a testament to how love, hope, and understanding could bridge any divide, heal any wound, and light the way forward for countless others to follow. 3 years after the flight that changed everything, the Tommy Reynolds Memorial Research Center had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The Shadow Protocol was now being implemented in hospitals across the country, and Task Force Hope had chapters in 20 states. But today wasn't about statistics or expansion. It was about something much more personal. Victoria hurried through the hospital's familiar corridors, her heels clicking against the polished floors. She was running late, thanks to a last-minute video call with the Foundation's board. As she rounded the corner to the pediatric ward, she nearly collided with Anderson. "Whoa there, Commander!" He caught her arm, steadying her. "The troops are already assembled." "Sorry," she caught her breath. "The board meeting ran long. Did I miss it?" Anderson's eyes twinkled. "Jake insisted on waiting for you. Said his graduation ceremony wouldn't be official without his whole unit present." Together, they entered the decorated common room where dozens of children, parents, and staff had gathered. At the front stood Jake, now 12, tall and healthy, wearing his Task Force Hope dress uniform, complete with commander bars that matched his father's old military insignia. "Attention!" Jake called out as they entered. The other children, some in treatment, some in remission, all wearing Task Force Hope shirts, snapped to playful attention. Dr. Patterson stepped forward carrying a folder. "Today, we're gathered to celebrate something extraordinary. 3 years ago, Jake Anderson became our first Shadow Protocol patient. Today, after his final scan showed no signs of recurrence for the 3rd straight year, we're officially declaring him cancer-free." Applause erupted through the room. Victoria felt tears welling up as she watched Jake stand proudly, no trace left of the sick little boy from that flight. Anderson squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening. "But that's not all we're celebrating," Dr. Patterson continued. "Thanks to the protocol developed from Jake's case and the support of the Tommy Reynolds Foundation, we've now successfully treated over 500 children nationwide. And today, we're proud to announce that the Shadow Protocol has been approved as a standard treatment option by the National Cancer Institute." More cheers filled the room. Victoria noticed Sarah, now one of Task Force Hope's junior leaders, wiping away happy tears. Jake stepped up to the microphone, his voice strong and clear. "When I was sick, my dad taught me that real soldiers never fight alone. That's why we created Task Force Hope. Because every kid deserves an army behind them. And now," he grinned, "I have an announcement of my own." He gestured to Anderson and Victoria. "Dad, Aunt Victoria, could you come up here?" They joined him at the front, exchanging curious glances. 3 years ago, you two showed me that miracles happen when different worlds come together. Dad with his military strength, and Aunt Victoria with her business superpowers." The room chuckled. "So I've decided what I want to be when I grow up." Jake stood straighter, looking every bit the commander he'd become. "I'm going to medical school, and then I'm coming back here. to help other kids fight their battles. Because that's what Task Force Hope taught me. Sometimes the best way to heal yourself is to help others heal too. Victoria couldn't hold back her tears anymore. Anderson pulled both her and Jake into a tight hug as the room erupted in applause. Later, as they shared celebration cake in the garden, Jake's idea to host it in Tommy's favorite place, Victoria watched the children playing, their laughter a testament to hope's triumph over fear. Anderson joined her, having changed from his suit into a Task Force Hope polo shirt. "You know," he said quietly. "I used to think saving my unit that day in Kandahar was my life's defining moment. But watching these kids, seeing what grew from our chance meeting." He shook, his head smiling. "Sometimes the biggest impacts come from the smallest moments of grace." Victoria touched the Task Force Shadow medallion she still wore. Tommy used to say that angels don't always have wings, sometimes they just have open hearts. Speaking of hearts, Anderson nodded toward Jake, who was teaching younger patients the Task Force Hope salute. "I'd say your brother would be pretty proud of his legacy." As the setting sun painted the garden in golden light, Victoria watched her unlikely family. The soldier who'd taught her about service, the boy who'd shown her true courage, and all the children whose lives they'd touched together. Sometimes, she realized, life's greatest missions don't come with medals or promotions. They come in moments of understanding, in bridges built between different worlds, and in the simple truth that hope, like love, only grows stronger when it's shared. Behind them, the Tommy Reynolds Memorial Research Center stood tall against the Seattle skyline, its windows reflecting the sunset. A beacon of light, just like Tommy had always wanted to be. As the sun rose over Seattle 5 years after that life-changing flight, the Tommy Reynolds Memorial Research Center bustled with its usual morning activity. But today was different. The halls were decorated with balloons and banners, and excited whispers filled the air. Victoria stood in the center's main lobby, surveying the transformation. Photos lined the walls, a visual timeline of their journey. The original Task Force Shadow team from Anderson's combat days. Jake in his hospital bed during treatment, the first Task Force Hope meeting, and now, their newest milestone. Task Force Hope, 1000th successful treatment celebration. "Ms. Reynolds?" A nurse approached with an urgent expression. "They're ready for you in the conference room." In the large conference room, screens displayed video feeds from Task Force Hope chapters across the country. The program had grown beyond their wildest dreams, with centers in every state and partnerships with major hospitals worldwide. Anderson sat at the head of the table, now the National Director of Military Family Support Services, coordinating care for veterans' children facing serious illnesses. "Everyone's connected," he reported, his face glowing with pride. "Even our new international chapters." Jake, now 14 and towering over most of his peers, stood beside a presentation screen. His Task Force Hope uniform had been updated with a special insignia, Junior Medical Cadet, reflecting his participation in the center's youth medical training program. "Ready, Commander?" Victoria asked, straightening his badge. Jake nodded, his confidence reminding her so much of his father. "All units reporting in, ma'am." The presentation began, with Jake addressing Task Force Hope members worldwide. He shared the latest treatment statistics, research breakthroughs, and stories of hope. But the biggest announcement was saved for last. "Today," Jake's voice carried clear and strong, "we're launching the Tommy's Angels Scholarship Program. Every Task Force Hope member who dreams of entering the medical field will have their education fully funded. Because the best way to fight these battles is to train the warriors who've been on the front lines themselves." Victoria watched the screens fill with jubilant faces, children who had once been patients, now dreaming of becoming doctors, nurses, and researchers. Sarah, their second success story, was already in pre-med classes, her full ride courtesy of the foundation. Anderson joined them at the podium, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "When I carried my brothers out of combat," he said quietly to the cameras, "I never imagined that act would lead to saving thousands of children. But that's how hope works. It grows in unexpected places, planted by unexpected people." After the presentation, they gathered in Tommy's garden, the center's rooftop sanctuary that had become a place of peace for families in treatment. Victoria found herself standing before the memorial wall, where Tommy's photo smiled beside the task. Foreshadow motto, "No one fights alone." "Aunt Victoria." Jake appeared beside her, holding something in his hands. "Dad and I have been working on this for months. We wanted it to be perfect." He handed her a small box. Inside lay a new medallion, its surface gleaming in the morning. Light. One side bore the Task Force Hope insignia, a pair of wings surrounding a medical cadet. The other side read, "Tommy's Angels, where warriors become healers." "It's beautiful," she whispered, tracing the words. "Look at the edge," Anderson suggested, joining them. Around the medallion's rim, tiny letters spelled out, "In memory of those who taught us that true strength lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall." Below were two dates, the day of the IED attack that had shaped Anderson's life, and the day Victoria had lost Tommy. "Because both days," Jake explained, "led us here, to helping others rise." A commotion at the garden entrance drew their attention. Sarah had arrived with a group of Task Force Hope cadets, all wearing their medical training uniforms. Behind them came Dr. Patterson, pushing a wheelchair carrying a young girl, their newest patient, recently arrived from a military base in Germany. "Commander Jake," the girl called out shyly, "the nurses said you'd show me how to be brave." Jake straightened, every inch his father's son. "First rule of Task Force Hope," he said, kneeling beside her wheelchair. "You already are brave. We just help you remember it." As Victoria watched Jake begin his gentle mentoring, a ritual he'd performed hundreds of times now, she felt Anderson's presence beside her. "You know what I realized?" he said softly. "That day on the plane, we were both lost in our own ways. Me in my fear for Jake, you in your grief for Tommy. But sometimes being lost is just life's way of helping us find a bigger purpose." Victoria clutched the new medallion, feeling its weight, the weight of all they'd built, all they'd healed, all they'd become. "To Tommy," she whispered. "To Task Force Shadow," Anderson added. "To Task Force Hope," Jake called from across the garden, having heard their quiet toast. Around them, the city of Seattle awoke to another day, unaware that in this rooftop garden, warriors and healers, soldiers and civilians, the wounded and the mending had found something remarkable. The truth that every end can be a beginning. Every scar can be a lesson, and every heart has the capacity to help another heal. And somewhere, Victoria liked to think, Tommy was smiling. 7 years after the fateful flight, the Tommy Reynolds Memorial Research Center had evolved into a sprawling medical complex that spanned 3 city blocks. The original building, where Jake had received his life-saving treatment, now served OI as the central hub for what locals called Hope City, a comprehensive care facility that combined cutting-edge medical research with military-inspired support systems. Victoria sat in her office reviewing the latest expansion plans when a familiar knock interrupted her thoughts. Jake, now 16 and nearly as tall as his father, stood in the doorway wearing his white medical cadet uniform. "Aunt Victoria, you need to come to the auditorium," he said, barely containing his excitement. "Dad's about to make the announcement." Together they hurried through the sky bridge connecting the research center to the new family housing complex, the Warriors. Haven, as it was known, provided free accommodation for military families during their children's treatments. Victoria remembered how Anderson had once worked 3 jobs just to afford a hotel room. Now no family had to face that struggle alone. The auditorium was packed. Anderson stood at the podium, his Task Force Hope Director's uniform adorned, with both his military honors and medical service awards. Dr. Patterson sat nearby, surrounded by a team of international researchers. 7 years ago, Anderson began, his voice carrying the same steady strength it had on that first flight. A chance encounter between two people from different worlds led to a miracle. Today, we're here to announce that miracle is about to reach even further. He gestured to the screen behind him, where a satellite map appeared. The Shadow Protocol has now successfully treated over 3,000 children worldwide, but for many families, traveling to our treatment centers remains a challenge. That ends today. The map zoomed in to show multiple locations across the globe. Thanks to the Tommy Reynolds Foundation's partnership with international medical organizations and military bases worldwide, we're launching Task Force Hope mobile response units. These fully equipped medical centers will bring our treatments directly to children in need, wherever they are. Victoria felt tears welling up as she watched the presentation. Each mobile unit would be staffed by Task Force Hope graduates, former patients who had gone on to become medical professionals. Sarah, their second success story, was already leading the pilot program while completing her accelerated pre-med studies. But that's not all, Anderson continued, smiling at his son. I'm proud to announce that our medical cadet program, inspired by Jake's dream of becoming a doctor, has been officially accredited. Starting next year, we'll offer specialized training for young survivors who want to join the medical field. Every cadet will receive full scholarships through medical school. Jake squeezed Victoria's hand as applause filled the auditorium. His own journey toward becoming a doctor had inspired dozens of other young survivors to follow similar paths. After the presentation, they gathered in Tommy's garden, which had grown into a vast rooftop sanctuary. The original small memorial wall had evolved into a healing park, where families found peace among flowering trees and gentle fountains. The garden now connected all three buildings of the complex, its winding paths designed to give patients a sense of journey and progress. I have something to show you both, Jake said, leading them to a new section of the garden. A beautiful bronze sculpture stood in a quiet corner, a child in a hospital gown standing tall, supported by two figures. One wore military fatigues, the other a business suit. The artists wanted to capture where it all began, Jake explained. Look at the base. Victoria knelt to read the inscription. From a moment of conflict came a lifetime of healing. In honor of the flight that taught us hope has many uniforms. Anderson touched the sculpture gently. They got the details right, he observed, noting the artist had included his combat scars and Victoria's once signature designer heels. That's because I helped design it, Jake admitted. I wanted people to see that sometimes the biggest changes start with the hardest moments. A young patient approached them, her Task Force Hope cadet uniform still new and crisp. Commander Jake, the new family from Texas just arrived. They're really scared. Jake straightened immediately, every inch, the leader he'd become. On my way, Cadet Amy. Dad, Aunt Victoria. Want to help welcome them to the unit. They found the family in the Welcome Center, a father in military fatigues, fresh from deployment, and a mother trying to stay strong for their 9-year-old daughter. The IE scene was painfully familiar. Sergeant Martinez? Anderson stepped forward, extending his hand. Welcome to Task Force Hope. I'm Tom Anderson, and this is Jake, one of our first warriors, and Victoria Reynolds, our founding commander. The girl, bald from recent chemotherapy, looked up at Jake with wide eyes. Did you have the bad cells too? Jake knelt beside her wheelchair. I sure did, soldier. Want to see something cool? He pulled out his tablet, showing her his old brain scans next to his recent ones. See that? The Shadow Protocol helped my body fight off the bad cells. And now I'm learning to be a doctor so I can help other kids fight too. Victoria watched as hope flickered across the parents' exhausted faces. She remembered that hope. How it had felt when she first realized Jake might survive. How it had transformed her grief over Tommy into a mission to help others. Mrs. Martinez, she said softly, would you like to see where you'll be staying? The Warrior's Haven has a suite ready for your family. The mother's eyes filled with tears. We we can't afford. Task Force Hope takes care of its own, Anderson interrupted gently. Your husband served our country. Now it's our turn to serve your family. Later that evening, after helping the Martinez family settle in, Victoria found herself back in Tommy's garden. The sunset painted the Seattle skyline in shades of gold and purple, reflecting off the windows of the research center that bore her brother's name. Penny for your thoughts? Anderson joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Just thinking about how far we've come, she replied, accepting the coffee. Remember when I accused you of expecting special treatment? Anderson chuckled. Remember when I thought you were just another angry civilian? Look at this. Victoria gestured to the complex around them. All because we were willing to see past our first impressions. Speaking of seeing things, Anderson's eyes twinkled. Jake wanted me to run something by you. He's been working with the research team on a new project. He pulled out a tablet, showing her a complex medical diagram. They've identified a way to modify the shadow protocol for adult patients. The trial proposal is ready, but they need a program director who understands both the medical and military aspects. Victoria studied the proposal, her heart racing. Adult patients, you mean? Veterans with service-related brain injuries, Anderson nodded. Jake says if it works, it could help thousands of soldiers struggling with traumatic brain injuries. He wants to call it Operation Second Chance. Victoria felt tears spilling down her cheeks. Tommy would have loved that. Using what we learned. From helping children to heal their parents, too. Dad, Aunt Victoria. Jake's voice carried across the garden. He was jogging toward them, his cadet uniform slightly rumpled from a long day of patient rounds. The Martinez girl, Elena, her initial test just came back. She's a perfect candidate for the shadow protocol. Victoria watched as Jake pulled up Elena's scans on his tablet, explaining the treatment plan with the confidence of a seasoned medical professional. Gone was the scared little boy from the plane. In his place stood a young man who had transformed his own battle into a mission to help others fight theirs. You know what this means? Jake grinned. She'll be our first patient to benefit from the new integrated program. Medical treatment, family housing, school support, and psychological care, all in one place. Anderson wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, pride radiating from his face. Task Force Shadow taught me that the strongest teams are built from different strengths. Look at us, a soldier, a businesswoman, and a warrior-turned-healer. And it all started with an argument on a plane, Victoria mused, touching her Task Force Hope medallion. Above them, stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the complex, children were healing, families were finding hope, and the next generation of medical warriors was training to continue their mission. To Tommy, Victoria whispered, raising her coffee cup. To Task Force Shadow, Anderson added. To Task Force Hope, Jake completed their ritual toast, and all the battles yet to come. In Tommy's garden, under the Seattle stars, 3 people from different worlds stood united in a mission born from conflict and nurtured by understanding. The lights of Hope City glowed around them, a beacon for all who needed to remember that sometimes the greatest healing comes from the most unexpected beginnings. And in the quiet evening air, the bronze sculpture stood watch, telling their story to all who passed, how a moment of darkness on a plane had led to a lifetime of light, and how hope, once ignited, could illuminate countless paths home. 10 years after the flight that changed everything, the Tommy Reynolds Memorial Research Center had become a global symbol of hope. The complex, now spanning 5 city blocks and affectionately known as Hope City, had transformed the face of pediatric care worldwide. On this particular morning, Victoria stood in the newly completed Skybridge Observatory, watching the sunrise paint the Seattle skyline gold. Morning, Commander. Jake's voice carried across the observatory. At 19, he'd grown into a remarkable young man, already in his second year of medical school, thanks to the accelerated program they'd developed for Task Force Hope cadets. His white coat bore both the medical school insignia and the Task Yao Force Hope emblem. "You're up early," Victoria observed, noting the stack of files in his arms. "Big day," he smiled. "The first group of veterans starts the modified Shadow Protocol trials. Dad's nervous, even though he won't admit it. Operation Second Chance had moved from concept to reality faster than anyone expected. After 2 years of intensive research and development, they were ready to begin treating veterans suffering from traumatic brain injuries using an adapted version of the protocol that had saved Jake's life. "Dr. Anderson," a young resident hurried toward them. Even after all these years, it still took Victoria a moment to realize they were calling for Jake, not his father. "The first patient is here." They made their way to the new Veterans Treatment Wing, where Anderson stood in his Task Force Hope Director's uniform, greeting a familiar face, Master Sergeant Mike Chen, one of his former teammates from Task E, Force Shadow. "Mike," Anderson embraced his old friend, careful of the visible tremors that plagued the veteran's right side. "Welcome to Hope City," Chen managed a shaky smile. "Never thought I'd be taking orders from your kid, Tom." "Technical civilian rank of Doctor supersedes military rank, Sergeant," Jake quipped, falling easily into the military banter he'd grown up with. "But I promise to be a benevolent commander." Victoria watched as Jake began his preliminary examination, his manner professional yet comforting. She remembered the scared little boy from the plane, and now here he was, about to treat one of his father's combat brothers. "Ms. Reynolds?" Sarah appeared at her elbow, now a fourth-year medical student and head of the Task Force Hope Mobile Response Unit program. "The international conference call is starting in 5 minutes." The conference room was filled with screens showing Task Force Hope centers from around the world. What had started in Seattle had grown into a global network, with facilities on every continent. Victoria took her seat beside Anderson, who had finally joined them after ensuring Chen was settled. 10 years ago, Victoria began, addressing the gathered faces. "A chance encounter on a plane led us to discover that hope speaks all languages. Today, we're expanding that mission further." She nodded to Sarah, who pulled up the presentation they'd been working on for months. "The Shadow Protocol has successfully treated over 5,000 children worldwide. Operation Second Chance is beginning trials for veterans today. And now we're launching Phase 3, Project Legacy." The screens filled with blueprints for a new addition to Hope City. The Tommy Reynolds Medical Academy, a full-scale medical school dedicated to training survivors and their families in specialized care techniques. "Every person who walks through our doors carries a story," Victoria continued. "Project Legacy will ensure those stories become part of the cure. Who better to heal than those who understand the battle firsthand?" After the presentation, they gathered in Tommy's garden, which had grown into a sprawling rooftop park connecting all of Hope City's buildings. The original bronze sculpture had been joined by others, each telling a part of their story. "Remember this spot?" Jake asked, leading them to a quiet corner where the first Task Force Hope meeting had been held. A plaque marked the location, where Hope found its army. "Hard to believe it all started with you two nearly coming to blows on a plane," Sarah teased, joining them with her tablet displaying Chen's initial treatment results. "How's he doing?" Anderson asked, trying to mask his concern. "Responding well to the preliminary treatment," Jake reported professionally, then broke into a grin. "Actually, he's already demanding to know when he can return to his volunteer work with veteran support groups." Speaking of support groups, Victoria pulled out her tablet. "The new family accommodation wing is ready. We can now house twice as many families during treatment." They were interrupted by a commotion near the garden entrance. Elena Martinez, their first integrated care success story from 3 years ago, was leading a tour group of new patients and their families. Now 13 and cancer-free, she served as a junior cadet, her Task Force Hope uniform decorated with service pins. "And this is Tommy's garden," they heard her explaining. named after our founding commander's brother. See that statue? That's Commander Reynolds and Director Anderson, from the day everything started. Victoria felt tears welling up as she watched Elena, remembering the terrified 9-year-old who'd arrived at Hope City barely able to walk. Now she stood tall and strong, sharing her story to help others find courage. Aunt Victoria? Jake touched her arm gently. There's something else we want to show you. They took the elevator to the top floor of the new research wing. The doors opened to reveal a space Victoria had never seen before, a circular room with walls covered in photographs. She gasped as she recognized the faces. Every patient we've helped, Anderson explained softly. Every battle won, every life changed. And in the center, in the middle of the room, stood a holographic display. As they approached, it activated, showing a young man's face, Tommy's face, reconstructed from photographs and home videos. Jake and the tech team have been working on this for months, Sarah explained. It's an interactive memorial. It tells Tommy's story and how his legacy led to all of this. Victoria reached out to touch the display, and Tommy's voice filled the room, created from old recordings but remarkably lifelike. Sometimes the biggest acts of courage are simply refusing to give up hope. That's not all, Jake said quietly. Watch. The display shifted, showing a timeline that branched out from Tommy's story. Every life saved, every family helped, every medical breakthrough achieved. The branches kept growing, spreading across the walls to connect with the photographs. The Hope Network, Anderson explained. Every person connected to every other, showing how one life can touch thousands. Victoria couldn't speak through her tears. She watched as the network pulsed. With light, each connection representing a moment of healing, of hope, of life restored. A soft beep from Jake's tablet interrupted the moment. Dad, Aunt Victoria, Chen's first full treatment is starting. Would you like to be there? They made their way back to the veterans' wing, where Chen lay prepared for the procedure. Jake moved with confident efficiency, explaining each step to his patient, his father's brother-in-arms, now his own patient to heal. You know, Tom, Chen said as the treatment began, when you carried me out of that firefight in Kandahar, I thought that was the only time you'd save my life. Guess your kid had other ideas. Victoria watched from the observation room as Jake administered the treatment that had saved his own life, now modified to heal the men and women who had served alongside his father. Anderson stood beside her, both of them remembering that first flight, that first argument, that first moment of understanding. To Tommy, she whispered their ritual toast. To Task Force Shadow, Anderson added. To Task Force Hope, Jake's voice came through the intercom. And all the lives we've yet to touch. In Tommy's garden, as evening fell over Hope City, the lights came on one by one, creating a constellation of hope visible from across Seattle. The bronze figures stood watch in the growing darkness, telling their story to all who passed. How a moment of conflict had birthed a lifetime of healing, and how hope, once ignited, could light the way home for countless others. And somewhere, Victoria liked to think, Tommy was smiling.